In 1659, if you celebrated Christmas in Boston, you could be fined 5 shillings. That's roughly a week's wages for an average worker. No decorations, no feasting, no carols, just an ordinary December 25th, or face punishment. The Puritans who fled religious persecution in England had created their own form of religious control, and Christmas was their target. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Across centuries and continents, Christmas has been banned, regulated, and outlawed more times than you might imagine. Today, we're uncovering the strange and often shocking laws that tried to stop the world's most celebrated holiday. Welcome to Logic Over Spirit, where we examine history through the lens of reason and inquiry. Christmas, as we know it today, feels timeless and universal. Families gathering gifts, exchanged, trees adorned with lights. It seems almost impossible to imagine a world where this celebration could be considered dangerous, immoral, or even illegal. Yet throughout history, powerful institutions, governments, and religious authorities have viewed Christmas with suspicion, hostility, and outright fear. What could possibly be threatening about a holiday centered on peace and goodwill? The answer reveals something profound about human nature. About the tension between individual freedom and institutional control, between tradition and ideology, between the sacred and the secular. To understand why Christmas has been banned requires us to look beyond the surface of tinsel and tradition. We must examine the philosophical battles over how societies should be organized, what behaviors should be permitted, and who gets to decide what is truly sacred. This is not simply a story of religious extremism or governmental overreach, though both play their parts. This is a story about power, about cultural identity, about the eternal human struggle between celebration and solemnity, between joy and discipline, between the material and the spiritual. As the philosopher Blaise Pascal once observed, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. The banning of Christmas provides a perfect case study for this observation. So let us journey through time and across continents to discover the strange laws and bans that sought to erase Christmas from human experience. What we'll find might challenge everything you thought you knew about this beloved holiday. Chapter 1: The Puritan War on Christmas. To understand the first major Christmas ban in the English-speaking world, we need to travel back to 17th century England and then across the Atlantic to colonial America. The Puritans, a Protestant group seeking to purify Christianity from what they saw as Catholic corruption, had a particular problem with Christmas, but their objection wasn't what you might expect. The Puritan opposition to Christmas was deeply philosophical and theological. They believed in sola scriptura, the principle that Scripture alone should guide Christian practice. When they searched the Bible for mentions of Christmas celebrations, they found nothing. The date of December 25th appears nowhere in biblical text. The shepherds watching their flocks by night, the wise men traveling from the east. These stories contain no calendars, no instructions to celebrate annually. From a purely logical standpoint, the Puritans had a point. Christmas as a fixed celebration was a human invention, not a divine commandment. But their critique went deeper. The Puritan worldview emphasized austerity, discipline, and constant spiritual vigilance. They saw the Christmas festivities of their time not as innocent celebration, but as dangerous excess. The holiday had become associated with drunkenness, gambling, sexual promiscuity, and what they called disorder. People would feast for days, sometimes weeks. They would play games, dance, and engage in role reversals where servants became masters and masters became servants. The Christmas season had become, in essence, a prolonged period of social chaos. In 1644, the English Parliament, controlled by Puritan forces during the English Civil War, officially banned Christmas. The law mandated that December 25th be treated as a regular working day. Markets must remain open. Shops must conduct business as usual. Any church services specifically for Christmas were forbidden. The punishment for violation could include fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. The philosophical reasoning was clear. If something isn't explicitly commanded by God, and if it leads to behavior that violates God's laws, then celebrating it becomes not just unnecessary, but sinful. The Puritans believed they were protecting society from moral decay. They saw themselves not as killjoys but as guardians of genuine spirituality against superficial festivity. But here's where it gets interesting. The ban was massively unpopular. In England, there were Christmas riots. In Canterbury in 1647, a large crowd tore down decorations that had been banned, and confrontations with authorities turned violent. People saw Christmas not just as a religious observance but as a cultural rite, a time-honored tradition that connected them to their ancestors and to each other. The philosophical conflict was no longer just about scripture versus tradition. It had become about authority versus liberty, about who had the right to dictate how ordinary people spent their time and expressed their joy. When the Puritans established colonies in New England, they brought their Christmas ban with them. In 1659, the Massachusetts Bay Colony made the law explicit. Anyone found observing any such day as Christmas through feasting, forbearing from labor, or any other means would be fined 5 shillings. This wasn't a suggestion. It was criminal law, enforced by magistrates who took their duty seriously. The ban lasted for 22 years in Massachusetts. Finally repealed in 1681, though Christmas didn't become a legal holiday in Massachusetts until 1856. Think about that timeline. Nearly 2 centuries of official discouragement, even after the explicit ban was lifted. The cultural impact was profound. Even today, historians note that New England has a different relationship with Christmas than other American regions, a legacy of Puritan influence. The Puritan Christmas bans raise fundamental questions about religious freedom and governmental power. These were people who had fled religious persecution in England, seeking freedom to worship according to their conscience. Yet once in power, they created laws that restricted others' religious and cultural practices. The philosopher John Stuart Mill would later write, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others." Were Christmas celebrations causing harm to others, or were the Puritans simply imposing their particular vision of morality on everyone else? This question resonates through all the Christmas bans we'll examine. When does protection of society become oppression of individual liberty? When does religious conviction become religious tyranny? The Puritans believed they had clear answers. History has judged them more harshly. Chapter 2: Soviet Atheism and the War on Religion. Now let's leap forward in time and across the world to examine a very different kind of Christmas ban. One rooted not in religious purity, but in its opposite, state-mandated atheism. The Soviet Union's approach to Christmas reveals another philosophical dimension to our story. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917, they inherited a deeply religious society where the Orthodox Church held enormous influence. Christmas, celebrated on January 7th, according to the Orthodox calendar, was one of the most important holidays in Russian life. But the new communist government, guided by Marxist philosophy, saw religion as the opium of the people, a quote from Karl Marx that shaped Soviet policy for decades. The philosophical foundation of the Soviet Christmas ban was materialism, the belief that only physical matter is real and that spiritual or supernatural claims are illusions that distract from material reality. In this worldview, Christmas wasn't just unnecessary, it was actively harmful because it perpetuated what the Soviets saw as false consciousness, preventing workers from recognizing their true material conditions and organizing for revolution. The Soviet approach was methodical. In 1929, Christmas was officially eliminated as a holiday. January 7th became a regular working day. Churches that held Christmas services faced harassment and closure. Priests who continued traditional practices were arrested, exiled, or worse. But the Soviets understood something important about human nature. You cannot simply ban a tradition without offering something to replace it. This is where Soviet Christmas policy becomes philosophically fascinating. Rather than simply prohibiting celebration, the Soviet state attempted to secularize and redirect the festive impulse. They moved the focus to New Year's Eve, creating a holiday that preserved many Christmas elements, but stripped of religious meaning. The Christmas tree became the New Year's tree. Father Frost, Dead Moros, replaced Father Christmas, but he delivered presents on January 1st, not in connection with any religious observance. Gift-giving, feasting, and family gatherings continued, but now they celebrated the new year, not the birth of Christ. This reveals a sophisticated understanding of cultural psychology. The Soviet authorities recognized that humans have deep needs for ritual, celebration, and communal joy. These needs don't disappear just because an ideology declares them irrational. The challenge for the Soviet state was to fulfill these needs while eliminating their religious content. In philosophical terms, they were attempting to preserve the form while changing the substance, to maintain social cohesion through shared celebration while directing it toward secular, state-approved ends. But there's an irony here worth exploring. Marxism itself functions much like a religion. It has sacred texts, Marx and Engels and Lenin. It has prophets and heretics. It promises a future paradise, the communist utopia. It demands faith in historical inevitability, and it persecutes those who question its doctrines. In banning Christmas for being irrational superstition, the Soviets were essentially privileging one unfalsifiable belief system over another. The philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, who influenced Marx, argued that humans create God in their own image, projecting human qualities onto a divine being. But couldn't the same be said of historical materialism? The Soviets projected their desires for justice and equality onto the historical process, seeing inevitable progress toward communism just as Christians saw inevitable progress toward the kingdom of God. Both required faith in things unseen. During World War II, Stalin briefly relaxed restrictions on the Orthodox Church. Recognizing that religious sentiment could be mobilized for national defense, churches reopened. Christmas services resumed, though carefully monitored. This pragmatic reversal reveals something crucial. Even totalitarian states must accommodate human nature when survival is at stake. Ideology bends to necessity. After the war, restrictions returned, but they were never quite as severe. The Soviet state had learned that direct suppression of Christmas was counterproductive. Better to redirect and secularize than to ban and martyr. By the 1960s and 70s, the New Year celebration had become thoroughly established, a genuinely popular holiday that most Soviet citizens embraced. The religious Christmas continued in private, in families that kept the faith, but publicly, New Year reigned supreme. What can we learn from the Soviet approach? Perhaps that human needs for celebration and meaning-making are more fundamental than any ideology. The Soviets tried to create a purely rational materialist society, but they couldn't eliminate the human hunger for ritual and transcendence. They could only redirect it. As the psychologist Carl Jung observed, the gods have become diseases. When traditional religious expressions are suppressed, the spiritual impulse doesn't disappear. It manifests elsewhere, sometimes in pathological forms, sometimes in new rituals that serve similar psychological functions. The Soviet Christmas ban also raises questions about the relationship between culture and power. Every government, whether religious or secular, whether democratic or authoritarian, faces the question of which cultural practices to permit, encourage, or suppress. The Soviets believed they were liberating people from religious superstition. Many of their citizens experienced it as cultural genocide, the destruction of traditions that connected them to their ancestors and gave meaning to their lives. Who was right? The answer depends on whether you believe governments exist to perfect their citizens, according to some ideological blueprint, or to protect citizens' freedom to find their own sources of meaning and joy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Christmas in Russia experienced a remarkable resurrection. Churches filled. Christmas services became public spectacles. The holiday that had been pushed into shadow for 7 decades re-emerged into light. This suggests something about the resilience of cultural traditions. You can ban them, redirect them, mock them as superstition, but if they speak to deep human needs, they survive, waiting for the moment when they can flourish again. Chapter 3: When Cultures Clash. Christmas bans aren't just a Western phenomenon, and they're not just about Christian theology or communist ideology. Around the world, various societies have restricted or banned Christmas for reasons ranging from cultural preservation to religious purity to political stability. These cases reveal yet another dimension of our story: the tension between dominant and minority cultures, between tradition and modernization, between tolerance and identity. Let's start in Brunei, a small but wealthy nation on the island of Borneo. In 2014, Brunei began enforcing existing laws that banned public Christmas celebrations. No decorations in public spaces, no Christmas hats, even privately, no Christmas songs. Muslims caught celebrating Christmas could face up to 5 years in prison. Non-Muslims were permitted to celebrate only in their homes, behind closed doors, with no visible signs to the outside world. The official justification was protecting the Muslim community from what authorities called excessive religiosity of other faiths. In a nation where Islam is the official religion and the Sultan holds absolute power, Christmas was seen as a threat to Islamic identity. This wasn't presented as oppression, but as preservation. From the government's perspective, they were maintaining cultural purity in the face of Western influence. This raises profound questions about pluralism and tolerance. In multicultural societies, how much religious expression should be permitted in public spaces? Brunei's position is that the majority faith deserves protection from minority faiths, that public displays of non-Islamic religion could confuse or convert Muslims, weakening the community's religious identity. It's a communitarian argument that prioritizes collective identity over individual freedom. The philosopher John Rawls proposed the idea of overlapping consensus, the notion that diverse people with different worldviews can agree on basic principles of justice and rights. But what happens when there is no consensus? When one group sees Christmas celebrations as a harmless expression of faith, and another sees it as cultural imperialism or religious pollution, Rawls's theory assumes good faith and willingness to find common ground. Brunei's Christmas ban suggests that not all societies accept these liberal premises. Similar restrictions exist in Somalia, where the government banned Christmas celebrations in 2015. Claiming they had no place in a Muslim society and could threaten national security. In Saudi Arabia, Christmas has long been unofficial but stringently suppressed. The religious police, the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, would raid homes suspected of celebrating Christmas, confiscating decorations, and sometimes arresting expatriate workers. These bans reflect a particular Islamic theological position. Not all Muslim scholars agree that Christmas celebrations should be banned. Many argue that Islam teaches respect for people of the book, including Christians, and that celebrating their holidays doesn't threaten Islamic faith. Here's where philosophy and religion intersect in interesting ways. Is religious truth exclusive or inclusive? If you believe your faith is the only path to truth, then other religious celebrations become at best distractions, at worst, dangerous deviations. This exclusivist position has philosophical implications. It suggests that truth is singular, that contradictory claims cannot both be true, and that protecting people from falsehood is a legitimate function of authority. But there's another philosophical tradition, one of pluralism and tolerance, articulated by thinkers like Voltaire, who famously wrote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." From this perspective, the strength of one's own faith shouldn't depend on suppressing other faiths. If Islam is true, it should be able to withstand the existence of Christmas decorations. If Muslims might be confused or converted by seeing a Christmas tree, what does that suggest about the foundation of their faith? Let's examine a different kind of cultural clash. In Tajikistan, a former Soviet republic with a Muslim majority, the government banned Christmas trees in schools in 2013, along with Father Frost costumes and gift exchanges. But this wasn't primarily about Islam. It was about post-Soviet identity formation. The government wanted to distance itself from Russian cultural influence, and New Year's celebrations with their secularized Christmas elements were seen as Russian imports that undermined Tajik national identity. This case illustrates how Christmas, or its secularized variants, can become a proxy for larger cultural and political conflicts. The question isn't really about whether children should have Christmas trees. It's about national sovereignty, about which culture will dominate, about whether a society will define itself in relation to its Soviet past or in opposition to it. China presents yet another variation. Christmas isn't banned in China, but it's heavily commercialized and stripped of religious content. Shopping malls have Santa, department stores have decorations, and young people exchange gifts. But any attempt to use Christmas for religious purposes, to hold large public worship services or distribute religious materials, faces restriction. The Chinese government permits Christmas as a consumer spectacle, but not as religious observance. This is sophisticated cultural management. The government recognizes that people enjoy celebration and that consumer spending benefits the economy, but they want to prevent any religious movement that could challenge state authority. Christmas becomes acceptable when it's about shopping and entertainment, dangerous when it's about faith and community. It's capitalism without transcendence, celebration without substance. What all these cases share is a belief that cultural identity is fragile, that it needs protection through law and enforcement. This reflects a particular philosophical anthropology, a view of human nature as easily influenced, in need of guidance and boundaries. It stands in contrast to the liberal view of humans as rational agents capable of making their own choices about meaning and value. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin distinguished between negative liberty, freedom from interference, and positive liberty, freedom to achieve one's potential. Christmas bans claim to promote positive liberty by preventing people from being exposed to confusing or corrupting influences. Authorities believe they're enabling people to truly flourish within their authentic cultural and religious traditions, but critics argue this is paternalism masquerading as liberation, that it denies individuals the negative liberty to make their own choices about celebration and belief. There's no easy resolution to these tensions. Multicultural societies must navigate between respecting majority cultural identities and protecting minority rights. They must balance preservation of tradition with openness to diversity. They must decide whether public spaces should reflect the dominant culture, remain neutral, or accommodate multiple traditions. Christmas, with its public nature and widespread appeal, becomes a flashpoint for these deeper conflicts. The bans we've examined in this chapter aren't just about Christmas, they're about power, identity, and the question of how diverse people can live together. They reflect different answers to fundamental questions. What is culture? Who defines it? How is it maintained? And when does protection become oppression? Chapter 4. The Forgotten Fascist Christmas. Most people don't associate fascism with Christmas bans, but the historical record reveals a complex and disturbing relationship between totalitarian regimes and the holiday. What makes this particularly interesting from a philosophical standpoint is that fascist Christmas policies weren't simply bans, but attempts to transform the holiday into propaganda, to hijack its emotional power for nationalist purposes. Nazi Germany provides the most extensively documented case. The Nazi approach to Christmas was schizophrenic. On one hand, Hitler and other Nazi leaders recognized Christmas as deeply embedded in German culture. Banning it outright would be politically disastrous. On the other hand, Christianity, with its Jewish roots and universalist message, contradicted core Nazi ideology. Their solution was to appropriate and distort Christmas. creating what they called German Christmas or wartime Christmas. The Nazis systematically removed Christian elements from Christmas celebrations. Jesus became secondary or disappeared entirely. Nativity scenes were discouraged. Christmas carols were rewritten to remove references to Jesus, Mary, and Christian theology. Silent Night became High Night of the Clear Stars. The holiday was reframed as a celebration of Germanic racial heritage, connecting to pre-Christian winter solstice festivals. Nazi Christmas imagery replaced angels with Nordic runes, replaced stars with swastikas, and replaced the story of Christ's birth with mythological Germanic heroes. Christmas became a celebration of blood and soil, of racial purity and national destiny. Hitler was sometimes portrayed in Christmas propaganda as a savior figure, bringing gifts to German children in the form of national renewal and military conquest. This represents a particular philosophical move, the subordination of all meaning-making to political ideology. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, analyzing totalitarianism, argued that such regimes seek to control not just behavior but thought itself, to eliminate any sphere of life independent from state ideology. Christmas, with its message of peace, its focus on a Middle Eastern Jewish child, its emphasis on universal humanity, had to be either eliminated or transformed into something that served Nazi purposes. The philosophical horror here is the total instrumentalization of the sacred. Christmas was valuable to the Nazis only insofar as it could be used to promote Nazi goals. Its intrinsic meaning, its connection to transcendent values, its call to love one's neighbor, all of this was stripped away, replaced with racial hatred and militaristic nationalism, dressed in festive clothing. In fascist Italy under Mussolini, the approach was somewhat different, but philosophically similar. Mussolini sought to reconcile Catholicism with fascism, creating what he called the Catholic-fascist. Christmas remained nominally Christian, but it was infused with fascist messaging. Church services included prayers for the fascist state. Christmas speeches emphasized Italian greatness and imperial destiny. The holiday became a tool for manufacturing consent, for blending religious sentiment with political loyalty. The Church's complicity in this raises difficult questions about institutional religion and political power. Some priests and bishops resisted, maintaining the authentic Christian message of Christmas. Others collaborated, allowing Christmas to become propaganda. This pattern repeats throughout history. Religious institutions faced with powerful secular authorities must choose between prophetic resistance and pragmatic accommodation. Christmas, as a major public religious observance, becomes a test case. Japan during World War II provides an interesting contrast. Christmas had become popular in Japan during the 1920s and 30s, adopted as a commercial and social celebration rather than a religious one. But as Japan moved toward militarism and ultranationalism, Christmas faced increasing restrictions. It was seen as an American and British import, associated with enemy nations. By the height of the Pacific War, Christmas celebrations were discouraged or banned as unpatriotic. This wasn't about religious purity or ideological purity in the same sense as the Nazi transformation. It was about wartime nationalism, about eliminating any cultural connection to the enemy. But the underlying logic is similar. Individual celebration must serve collective national goals. Personal enjoyment becomes suspect if it involves anything associated with hostile powers. What's philosophically significant about fascists' Christmas policies is their revelation of what happens when instrumental rationality completely dominates value rationality. The sociologist Max Weber distinguished between these two forms of rationality. Instrumental rationality asks, what's the most efficient means to achieve my goals? Value rationality asks, what goals are worth pursuing? What ends are good in themselves? Fascism is instrumental rationality run amok. Everything becomes a tool, including Christmas, including religion, including human beings themselves. There are no intrinsic goods, no values that stand above political utility. The German people matter only as raw material for racial empire. Christmas matters only as a vehicle for nationalist propaganda. Even children matter only as future soldiers. This total instrumentalization is, in a sense, the logical conclusion of certain strains of modern thought that reduce everything to power. If there's no transcendent good, if all values are human constructions, if might makes right, then why shouldn't Christmas serve the state's purposes? The fascist Christmas reveals where we end up when we abandon the idea that some things are sacred, that some values transcend political expediency. The horror isn't just in what the Nazis and fascists did. It's in the philosophical framework that made it possible, thinkable, even rational within their twisted system. When nothing is sacred, everything becomes a tool. When power is the only value, then anything that can be used to generate power should be used. Christmas, with its emotional resonance and cultural importance, was too valuable not to exploit. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, writing after the Holocaust, argued for an ethics based on absolute responsibility to the other, to the human face that calls us to recognize their infinite value. Fascism is the precise opposite. The other has no intrinsic value, only instrumental worth as a member of the correct race or nation. Christmas, properly understood, celebrates the ultimate other, God becoming human, the infinite entering the finite. No wonder fascism had to destroy or transform it. Chapter 5. What the Bans Reveal. We've journeyed from Puritan New England to Soviet Russia, from modern Islamic states to Nazi Germany, examining how and why authorities have banned or transformed Christmas. Now we need to step back and ask, what do these bans reveal about human nature, about power, about the role of celebration in human life? First, Christmas bans reveal the perceived power of cultural ritual. Authorities don't ban harmless things, they ban what they fear, and what they fear about Christmas is its ability to create community, to generate loyalty, to transmit values outside state control. Whether it's Puritan leaders worried about moral disorder, communist authorities concerned about religious consciousness, Islamic governments protecting cultural identity, or fascist regimes attempting to control all meaning-making, they all recognize that Christmas is powerful. Why is Christmas so powerful? The philosopher Emil Durkheim argued that religious rituals function to strengthen social solidarity, to bind communities together through shared sacred experiences. Christmas does this extraordinarily well. It brings families together, it creates shared memories, it marks time, giving rhythm to the year. It transmits values from generation to generation, often more effectively than formal education or explicit instruction. From this perspective, Christmas bans are attacks on social bonds that exist independently of state power. When families gather for Christmas, when communities celebrate together, they're creating loyalty and meaning that don't flow from governmental authority. This is threatening to any regime that wants total control over its citizens' lives and thoughts. Second, the bans reveal the limits of ideological control over human nature. Notice that almost every Christmas ban we've examined either failed, was relaxed, or required significant compromise. The Puritan ban was unpopular and eventually repealed. The Soviet ban had to be replaced with the secularized New Year celebration. Even Nazi Christmas transformation couldn't completely eliminate Christian elements. This suggests that certain human needs and impulses resist ideological suppression. What are these needs? The need for celebration, for breaking normal routine with special festivity. The need for ritual, for repeated actions that create meaning through performance. The need for gift-giving, for expressing love and building reciprocal relationships. The need for hope, for looking forward to something better. Whether that's a spiritual salvation or simply a joyful gathering, these needs are not infinitely malleable. They constrain what authorities can successfully impose. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre argues that humans are narrative beings, that we understand our lives as stories, and that we need shared narratives to create coherent communities. Christmas is a powerful narrative that has evolved over to millennia, incorporating elements from multiple cultures and adapting to changing circumstances. Authorities who try to ban or radically transform Christmas are attempting to erase or rewrite a narrative deeply embedded in cultural memory. This is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible to do completely. Third, Christmas bans reveal competing visions of the good life and the role of pleasure in human flourishing. The Puritans believed that pleasure was dangerous, that humans needed constant spiritual discipline, that joy should come only from contemplating God's glory, not from feasting and merriment. The Soviets believed that pleasure should be redirected toward collective goals, that celebration should serve the revolution, not religion or tradition. Islamic authorities in strict societies believe that pleasure must be contained within religious boundaries, that public displays of non-Islamic celebration threaten community cohesion. These different positions reflect different philosophical anthropologies, different views of what humans are and what makes for a good human life. The Aristotelian tradition sees pleasure as natural and good when properly directed by reason. The ascetic tradition sees pleasure as dangerous, pulling us away from higher goods. The utilitarian tradition sees pleasure as valuable only when it promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Christmas celebration forces us to confront these questions. Is pleasure good in itself? Does it need justification? Who decides which pleasures are acceptable? Fourth, the bans reveal the complex relationship between individual liberty and social order. Every society must balance freedom and control, autonomy and authority. The liberal tradition, emerging from thinkers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, argues for maximum individual liberty, compatible with others' equal liberty. From this view, Christmas bans are almost always unjustified. If my celebration doesn't directly harm you, what right do you have to forbid it? But communitarian and traditional philosophical perspectives question this individualism. They argue that societies need shared values and practices to function, that complete individualism leads to social fragmentation and enemy. From this view, some regulation of celebration might be justified to maintain social cohesion and shared identity. The question is where to draw the line. Christmas bans tend to draw the line in the wrong place, prioritizing ideological purity over human freedom and flourishing. But they force us to grapple with the real tension between individual liberty and social cohesion. Not all traditional practices are worth preserving. Not all individual choices are harmless to the community. Finding the right balance is one of the permanent challenges of political philosophy. Fifth, the bans reveal the danger of absolutist thinking. Whether it's the Puritan conviction that anything not explicitly biblical is sinful, the communist conviction that all religion is false consciousness, the fascist conviction that everything must serve the nation, or the strict Islamic conviction that public displays of known Islamic faith threaten the community, absolutist ideologies tend toward suppression of difference and complexity. The philosopher Karl Popper argued for what he called the open society, characterized by critical thinking, tolerance of diversity, and rejection of absolute certainty. He contrasted this with closed societies dominated by dogma and authority. Christmas bans are symptoms of closed thinking, of the belief that one has access to complete truth and that deviation must be suppressed. But here's the paradox: complete openness is impossible. Every society must have some boundaries, some shared commitments, some practices it encourages, and others it discourages. The question is how to maintain necessary social cohesion without sliding into totalitarian control. Christmas celebrations, because they're voluntary, communal, and meaningful without being coercive, might actually model a kind of social glue that free societies need. Banning them removes a mechanism for creating solidarity without force. Finally, the bans reveal something hopeful: the resilience of human celebration and meaning-making. Christmas has survived Puritan suppression, Soviet atheism, fascist transformation, and contemporary restrictions. It adapts, evolves, and persists. This suggests that while power can constrain and shape human culture, it cannot completely determine it. There remains a sphere of human freedom, creativity, and resistance that no authority can fully control. The Christmas bans throughout history aren't just historical curiosities. They're windows into fundamental questions about human nature, about freedom and authority, about the role of celebration in good human life. They remind us that the question of how we should live together, how much diversity we should tolerate, how to balance individual liberty with social cohesion, these are permanent questions without simple answers. As we navigate our own time, with its own conflicts over public celebrations, religious expression, and cultural identity, the history of Christmas bans offers both warning and wisdom. Warning about the dangers of ideological certainty and authoritarian control. Wisdom about the human need for celebration, community, and meaning beyond material survival or political loyalty. Conclusion: we began with the story of Christmas being illegal in Puritan Boston. A seemingly absurd historical footnote that turns out to reveal profound truths about power, culture, and human nature. We've seen how Christmas has been banned by religious zealots and militant atheists, by cultural protectionists and totalitarian regimes. We've examined these bans through philosophical and religious lenses, seeking to understand not just what happened but why it matters. What have we learned? That celebration is powerful, that it creates bonds and transmits values outside institutional control, that human nature resists complete ideological programming, that certain needs for ritual and festivity persist despite suppression, that competing visions of the good life lead to real conflicts about which celebrations should be permitted, that the balance between individual liberty and social cohesion is delicate and contested, and that absolutist ideologies, whether religious or secular, tend toward suppression of difference. But perhaps most importantly, we've learned that Christmas persists. It adapts and evolves, but it continues. This resilience suggests something profound about human creativity and the limits of authoritarian power. No matter how determined the authorities are, no matter how severe the punishments, humans find ways to celebrate, to create meaning, to gather in joy. The strange laws and bans throughout Christmas history aren't just about Christmas. They're about the eternal human struggle for freedom, for meaning, for the right to create and participate in cultural traditions that speak to our deepest needs and highest aspirations. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar dynamics in our own time, equipping us to defend the spaces of freedom that remain. As you celebrate this Christmas season, or choose not to, remember that this choice itself is a freedom worth protecting, that your ability to gather with loved ones, to exchange gifts, to participate or not in traditions. This freedom was denied to millions throughout history and remains denied to many today. It's a freedom worth cherishing, worth defending, and worth understanding. Here at Logic Over Spirit, we examine tradition through reason, faith through evidence, and history through clear-eyed analysis. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to join us on future journeys through the intersection of culture, philosophy, and history. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Christmas bans, on the balance between liberty and tradition, on what these historical cases teach us about our own time, and whether you're celebrating Christmas, ignoring it, or somewhere in between. May your choices be free, informed, and truly your own. That, perhaps, is the ultimate lesson of the strange laws and bans that tried and failed to eliminate Christmas from human experience. The human spirit, seeking meaning and celebration, resists control, and that resistance, that refusal to be completely programmed or suppressed, might be the most important freedom we possess. Thank you for watching Logic Over Spirit. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep seeking truth beyond easy answers.